All right, so it looks like we have about 2 viewers. So whoever those people are, if you could just let me know who you are and that you can hear me, we can begin. So I'm assuming one of you is Nathan. And the other one's Fox. Very good. Let's begin with the opening prayer. Magad hostes jureman, deletas deonidos, beotanna gistue kai, diasue taip sukan. All right, so I see Gigi's typing. Let's see what she has to say before we begin. Okay. So this video is definitely impromptu. It was planned for next week, and we're still going to do next week. But I would like to gradually shift towards a more frequent schedule. It'd be nice, perhaps, if we started doing this once a week. I've been talking about that for a little while. And there have been periodic times where I've tried to schedule some group meditations and things like that, but I've never made it official because it's always just when I have time, when it kind of works out for me. Last time I was scheduling pretty regular group meditations with everyone every couple of days in the evening. And I was kind of excited about getting that going, and then Veos came up to me the next week and kind of required a couple more hours of practice out of me each day and some things, so it kind of stole from that time. But it would be nice if soon we can. I'm always kind of working towards trying to do somewhat regular group meditations and more regular chats. So we'll see how that goes. But since I have some time now, I figured we'll do a chat now, and then everyone can just watch the video later. And that's fine, especially because Mars is very simple. Mars is a pretty clear lecture to cover. I don't think we need to cover much about it because a lot of its energy is very mundane. So it's easy to contemplate. More accurately, I could say that its energy is certainly very manifest in our world. We have a very Rajasic or very martial planet here. And it definitely has very divine attributes as well. But those attributes are easy to contemplate. The symbolism, it's not very vague. It's not very difficult to comprehend. So Mars doesn't require much effort. And additional to that, we've talked about Mars a little bit already. We talked about Mars a little bit when we talked about Venus, and it kind of comes up in some other places. So there's not much to discuss with Mars. So let's skim the lecture real quick and see what it has to say. Mars is the Roman name of the Greek god of war, Ares, the son of Zeus. The primary concern of Ares is military affairs and all manners of battles. One of the prominent stories in ancient mythology about Ares is his love for Aphrodite, a love which describes a great deal about both gods and how Mars and Venus work and interact with each other. So again, we've discussed this at length in the lecture on Venus and about the different loves that Venus has, right? The love with Adonis, the marriage to Hephaestus, and the love for Ares. And we've talked about what each of these means. And you kind of see a similar play here with Mars, where Aphrodite can follow her passions towards her lover Mars, or she can follow her passions towards her lover Adonis. And Adonis represents how her energy manifests in a spiritual way, and Mars, or Ares, represents how her energy manifests in a material way. Similarly, we see this with Dionysos, where not with Dionysos, but with Mars, where Ares is the god of war, and he only lays his weapons aside for Aphrodite or for Dionysos. And so this is how his energy is shown as manifesting in either a positive or a negative way. So when Aphrodite and when Ares, when their energies manifest in a negative way or a more mundane way, you see it through their love for each other. But when her love, or when her energy manifests in a more positive way, you see it through her love for Adonis. And when Mars' energy manifests in a more positive way, you see it through his devotion to Dionysos. And so you kind of see Dionysos and Aphrodite and Adonis and Mars as kind of being the same thing, where you see these two energies polarizing in either a positive way or a negative way. And then, of course, Aphrodite is married to Hephaestus. And we talked a little bit about that already as well in the previous lecture. Now, in some myths, it seemed that Aphrodite's, or her only spiritual child is with Adonis. But other myths, you see that she does have a child, and that child's name is Harmonia. And this child she has with Mars. And I believe we mentioned this already also, how the child between attraction and repulsion is Harmonia, which is obviously where we get our word for harmony from. Harmonia then becomes the wife of Cadmus, and Cadmus becomes the father of mankind. And he kind of becomes a symbol for the world king to a degree. And kind of like an emblem of the progenitor of mankind. And through a hidden way, Cadmus is actually also very deeply tied to Dionysos. Let's see if we pull up the myth for Cadmus here. You'll see that Cadmus, with Harmonia, is the father of Semele, Polydorus, Autonoe, Agave, and Ino. And there's another son there as well. But so what we see is Semele is the mother of Dionysos. So Dionysos has multiple parents because Dionysos has two births. He's two-formed. He has two births. He's two-natured. And both of these births represent Dionysos manifesting on multiple different levels. So the ancients made this very simple for us because Dionysos is seen as both a god and a man. And so they made it very simple for us by simply giving us two very distinct genealogies and births. And the higher one is Dionysos manifesting as deity, and the lower one is Dionysos manifesting as a man, an incarnation of that deity's energy. So Dionysos is protogonos phanes, he's the firstborn god, the true father of all the gods. And in this form, you see this very complicated, very kind of multi-tiered birthing process that Dionysos has to undergo because he's Phanes, right? Phanes it's the first being. So all things come from Protogonos Phanes. As a result, in order for Protogonos Phanes to manifest in the world, its energy has to be stepped down and broken down on many different levels by primal forces that become increasingly complex. And this is the manifestation of Dionysos the god. Then this works its way all the way through until Dionysos is born a second time. This second birth is by Semele, and this is Dionysos the man. Semele then is the daughter of Cadmus, who is the husband of Harmonia, who is the child of Aphrodite. So you kind of see these multiple connections here because then Aphrodite is the daughter of Kronos. So you kind of see all the complexities of how the Greek pantheon shows the connections between all these different energies and different deities. But Dionysos being the son of Cadmus kind of goes further to show that he's the child of mankind. It's his manifestation within man. This pulls us a little bit off track though. So looking back at the Mars lecture, we see a lot of stuff that that kind of is obvious, right? Like, he's the god of war, he's the god of the passions, speaking about Mars. That the passions naturally seek union with sensual pleasures for the sake of gratification. And this is the Mars energy manifesting through Aphrodite. It talks a little bit here about how Mars will lay aside his weapons for either Aphrodite or Dionysus, which we just spoke about. The potential energy of Mars can be directed towards the spiritual path and the attainment of spiritual liberation. Thus, the ancient astrologers considered the influence of Mars to be particularly important in giving the aspirant the necessary willpower and ambition to succeed in the spiritual path. You can definitely see this in the charts of a number of saints, but especially ones that had a strong role in the world, particularly great initiators, right? So like Hierophants, for example, oftentimes will have Mars powerfully aspected in their chart. There's a yoga, astrological combination in Jyotish called the Mahapurush Yoga. This means like the combination of the great soul. And it occurs with 5 of the different of the 9 planets. It can't happen with the luminaries, the sun and the moon, and it can't happen with Rahu and Ketu. But with the other planets, you can get something called a Mahapurush Yoga, which is when the planet is exalted in one of the 4 primary houses: the 1st, the 4th, the 10th, or the 1st, 4th, 7th, or 10th houses. And this is very common in Hierophants and initiators, people initiating great change in the world. It's common in people who aren't necessarily on the spiritual path, but need that kind of martial energy to initiate great change or to be great leaders. I haven't looked at George Washington's chart, but that would be an example of someone who would likely have Mars Mahapurush Yoga. And if he didn't, then he would at least need to have a strong Mars, because he was a general, he was a commander, he initiated great change, and then he became a president. So you see a lot of martial energy playing a role here. So this is a way in which Mars manifests in a positive way, right? It initiates positive change. But in order to do that, it has to cut off all things which would challenge this positive change. And so Ramos and Veos, for example, have a Mars Mahapurush Yoga in their chart, because they're Hierophants, they're initiators, they have a lot of that powerful martial energy. It's really necessary for magic to have a good Mars. And I don't have a Mars Mahapurush Yoga, but I am a Aries ascendant. So Mars is my ascendant lord, well placed in the 9th house. So this kind of thing is common with Mars. And this kind of gets to the root of the issue with Mars here, which is that Mars is a preserver. The very fundamental energy of Aries is that of a preserver. So we see the other preserver, the other primary preserver in the Greek pantheon is Athena. But Athena preserves in a different way. Athena preserves by absolute transcendence. Athena corresponds kind of to the ether and to pure spirit. This is why they say her eyes are sparkling and that she's blue-eyed. And she springs from the head of Zeus when Zeus digests wisdom within his mind. So Athena represents divine mind when it's cloaked in the energy of soul, right? It's a very pure, very divine energy. And she's immaculately conceived by the demiurge. So Athena represents the ether, this very divine energy. And so she preserves things by never letting them be mutated in the first place. So the preservation of Athena would be like that of an island nation who cannot be assailed because it's surrounded by oceans. And if we were to imagine that this island nation was surrounded by mountains and then also surrounded by a great wall, this fortress would be unassailable, and it would never need to do anything in order to protect itself. By its own nature, it would always be eternally protected. And this is kind of the nature of Athena. And in the personal self, she represents Gnosis. She represents the wisdom line and clairvoyance. She represents the awakening of the pineal gland. She represents the opening of the skull. In fact, in her mythology, she raises the Acropolis to establish not really her child, but someone that she sees as being kind of her child, a dragon, a serpent. She raises the Acropolis and establishes this serpent upon its throne. And this represents taking the serpent of the Sophic fire, the wisdom energy at the base of the spine, rising it up, and the Acropolis represents the skull. The raising of the Acropolis is the raising of the skull plates and the opening of the skull. So Athena represents these very sublime aspects, right? Like enlightenment, the opening of the skull, the opening of the wisdom line. Aries is the other preserver, but he preserves in a very different way. Aries preserves by cutting off all the things which would seek to mutate it. So now, rather than having this unassailable fortress, Aries represents the army which goes forth into battle. And by mingling with these energies of opposition, it cuts them off and protects them, protects the kingdom. So in us, this is very necessary because none of us are born perfectly enlightened. If we were born perfectly enlightened, then that would be Athena's energy manifest in the world. But instead, the energy we have to cling most powerfully to is the energy of Mars, because this is the power to cut off all things which would seek to assail our own goodness. It's certainly true that on the spiritual path, you're constantly on a battle. And this is true not just on the spiritual path, but for any human seeking to live a good life. Because what seems to be inherent to humans is a longing for all the things which are bad for us, right? Humans seek after the most, inherently seek after the most, the things which are of the least consequence, and seem to ignore the things that are of the greatest consequence. So if you look at the things people spend money on and the things that people spend time on, it tends to be things which are very unimportant to our soul, right? We spend money on tasty food. We spend money on things like entertainment, phones, TVs, movies, comfortable furniture, right? We spend money and we spend time investing in all of these things that are very frivolous and very evanescent. Whereas we spend very little time on things which actually nourish us, even on a physical level. Most of our society is sedentary, and people are much more likely to, after a long day of work, when they're tired, think, oh, you know, I'm going to sit on the couch, I'm going to watch TV, and this is how I'm going to recharge and relax. When in reality, if that person instead staved off their desire for entertainment and forced themselves into discomfort and willingly embraced hard work, they would find that if instead of relaxing, they did a little bit of exercise, they did a little bit of meditation, and they embraced the discomfort that those things bring, they would find that in the end, they're much more relaxed, much more happy, much more healthy. And it's very easy to see this, right? Like, for example, I don't need to convince any of you of this because you all experience it every day. You wake up in the morning and you think, oh, it would be nice to sleep a little bit longer. Or you think, oh, I should get X amount of sleep instead of waking up a little bit earlier so I can get a little bit of an exercise routine in. Or when you're dieting, you think, oh, a little bit of this unhealthy food won't be so bad for me. I'll bend the diet here, I'll bend it there. And in all these ways, we're seeking to avoid discomfort. We don't want to have discomfort on our palate. We don't want to have discomfort on our physical touch. In any way in which our senses have the option of comfort or discomfort, we always choose comfort. And in almost all situations, this is to our detriment. Not just to the detriment of our soul, but to the detriment of our very body, the thing which is generating and experiencing these senses. So that our physical body seeks food which is bad for it. It seeks a sedentary lifestyle, which is bad for it. So this is kind of the plague of humanity. And the one weapon we have against this is the power of Aries, the power of discipline, to understand and have that martial tendency within us to rise up and say, well, I'm tired, I've worked a really long day, and I feel like sitting in front of a TV is going to be the only thing that I can do right now because my mind is exhausted, my body is exhausted, and this is how I'm going to regenerate. And the power of Aries allows us to look at this feeling and understand through contemplation, right? Which is another power, right? We could look at this as being Hermes or some other power, but to use this and to use our knowledge and to use our faith and muster up our strength within us and say, no, I'm going to cut through this illusion. I'm going to cut through this temptation, and I'm going to make myself meditate. I'm going to make myself perform worship. I'm going to make myself perform prayer. And then in the end, you would find that you would never regret that decision. There's never a time you'll make that decision and at the end of a good long 1 hour practice routine think, oh, you know, I would have felt much better if I had just watched TV. I feel even more exhausted. I feel more miserable. You know, that could happen once a blue moon if you have a really bad practice. But I've never felt regret from having practice, especially when I had to make a hard choice and thought, well, I could do it this way, I could do it that way. I've never felt regret. And I've never heard of a single person who attained enlightenment and thought, you know, this was kind of a waste of time. I wish, you know, there were all those women I could have had sex with. There was all that money that could have been made. And instead I achieved enlightenment. What a waste. I've never heard that story told. And so this is kind of the power of Aries in the mystic's life and in the life of any human being in this world where push and pull is so apparent, where duality is so apparent, and we're constantly having to choose one thing over another. And we can't say that duality is just inherent in this world, right, where Mars and Aphrodite were tied together by Hephaestus. Duality exists up into the highest levels, right? Because as long as existence exists, there's duality, right? Protogenos phanes is the triad. The triad comes after the duad. The triad comes after the infinite and the bound. So there's always going to be a push and a pull. And if you're in the mountains and you're in the caves, then you're seeing this push and pull through discomfort and comfort. You're seeing it through hot and cold. You're seeing it through these different extremes. In the householder life, you see them just as apparent. You see it through criticism and compliment, and learning to feel them as the same, just as you would feel hot and cold as the same, where you don't just learn to take criticism and allow it to pass through you with a smile on your face, taking only from it what can benefit you and letting the rest pass effortlessly through you without disturbing you. But you do the same with compliment as well, so that when someone compliments you, it changes you in no greater or lesser a way as to if they had criticized you. Only taking from it what is necessary. Like a bee, taking what's necessary from the flowers in order to create a divine nectar. This is how we should treat our interactions with others. So again, we got a little bit off track, but not too much, right? Because we're talking about the energy of Mars and how we need to manifest it in our own life. And if you feel like you're really lacking in this energy, then it's kind of a difficult one to harness, because you need discipline to build discipline. And it creates a kind of momentum where the more discipline you're employing in your life, the more it kind of seems to snowball and generate inside of yourself, so that every day that you're living in a disciplined way, every day you're entering into what they call a flow state, the deeper that flow state comes, and the more you almost feel like you have this momentum driving you forward through success. So it can be very hard to start that process and to generate it. And of course, whether you're already in a great state of momentum or whether you're just trying to generate it now, worshiping Aries and doing prayers and expiations to him are beneficial in this regard. And so performing a pentaspendia to Aries, for example, would be very beneficial. So let's see what else we have. Mars is the lord of the two zodiac signs, Aries and Scorpio, the functions of which are considerably different. Aries is a powerful force of initiation and represents the initial lightning fire when the flame first begins to consume and rises to its highest height, while Scorpio represents creating and consuming heat at the end of a fire, which breaks down its fuel and transforms it into an ash. Another way you can view it is that the Aries is like the Big Bang, the energy of the Big Bang, right? So like in the cycle of creation, the zodiac should be understood as cyclically, that they actually go in succession from Aries all the way through to Pisces and then back around to Aries and beginning a new cycle. And so the first cycle then is Aries. It's the first emergence, right? It's the first dawn of light. Whether you see this and its symbolism through the Big Bang, or whether you see it in its symbolism through within the womb of a mother, whether you see it through the birth of a child, this first light, this initiating force is Aries. Before an idea even begins to generate in your mind, the light of Aries has already made itself known within your subconscious. Whereas Scorpio represents the kind of latent heat. When you compost material, for example, if you take a bunch of ash, if you take a bunch of leaves and manure and different composting material and you put it all into a pile and you sit it out there, that will start to generate a heat of its own. If you let this compost and for days and weeks, and then you start to dig it up and you open it up, you'll see fumes coming out of the composting pile, and it will be hotter than it is outside. It's generating its own kind of latent heat, and this latent heat is kind of destroying everything in that pile. And this is kind of the energy that's associated with Scorpio, and this is why it's associated with poisons and venom as well, hence the name Scorpio. But it can be used in a very positive way. And so Scorpio comes right before Sagittarius because Scorpio represents the sting of the serpent, of the Kundalini energy before enlightenment. And this is why you see it in a lot of myths as well. A lot of solar heroes being stung by the scorpion before they die and go through a rebirth into their enlightenment. Scorpio is a much more mystical and esoteric sign, while Aries is an exoteric and outward sign, and thus both the Aphrodite and Dionysos-inspired powers of Mars are represented by Aries and Scorpio, respectively. One of the epithets of Mars is earthborn, and refers to an esoteric connection between Earth and Mars. Mars has a particularly profound influence upon this planet, especially in this day and age, and is often used by master astrologers to determine world events and weather cycles. The red planet has a secret history with the Earth. It has a secret future with the Earth as well. And an important future, which it says, and an important future as well for all of mankind, the details of which will be covered in some detail in the lectures after initiation into the order. Yeah, certainly that's not even covered immediately after initiation, but covered sometime thereafter. The primary impetus of Mars is to move, overcome, and destroy if necessary. Among the planets, it is an all-consuming fire, and often its energies depict a wrathful form of God. In the Hindu pantheon, we'd see this as Kartikeya, right? The child of Shiva. And so again, you see the connection between Shiva and Dionysos, the connection between Aries and Dionysos, and Shiva and Kartikeya, Shiva and Mars. You see the connection there. Where Kartikeya was formed by a single droplet of semen, which emerged from Shiva and burned through all of the different worlds, tearing its way through the highest plane of spirit all the way down into matter, where it began to congeal and form into the planet Mars itself. So here it refers to its name in Judaism, Elohim Gibor of the Jews, which means the God of strength. Or Horus, the Avenger of the Egyptians. It is the wrathful form of God. Why is such a form possible, one might ask? God in his various manifestations must represent the entire universe which is contained within him. In other words, nothing exists that did not come from God, and any time one thing is the source of many. The first emanations are always the most general and closest to the one. Hence, in this case, there is an archetype of conflict, one which exists in potential by the very laws of the universe whenever two things exist of a different nature. This conflict can only exist if each thing has the power to act. And it is the primordial power to act that is the seed of the martial energy, while it is the inevitable conflict which results that is often depicted as the planet Mars itself. To clarify, each thing in nature can only enter into conflict if its path interferes with another thing's path. It is the ability to initiate a path at all that is the seed power of Mars, which we can call the energy of Aries, or the primal initiating energy that turns potential energy into kinetic energy. It is erroneous to say that this energy is itself Mars, but rather it should be understood that this energy allows for a world of conflict to exist, and it is this conflict which is traditionally considered to be the esoteric meaning of Mars. So you see this in the zodiac, right? Because the zodiac each one of the zodiac corresponds to an element. So there are 4 elements and 12 zodiacal powers. So we see that each element has a positive, a neutral, and a negative manifestation. And you can kind of see it as it's a manifestation where the element comes to be, where the element vivifies its nature, and where it returns itself back, right? So if you look at the Platonic Trinity that we've talked about before, the most Platonic way to describe this would be to say that one energy is preceding, the other is sustaining, and the other is returning. And so the preceding power, and this actually works in order with the zodiac. So the first one of an element is always going to be the preceding power, the second is going to be the sustaining, and the third is going to be the returning. So the preceding power of the fire element in the zodiac is Aries. And this is kind of what's talked about here, where it's the seed energy first manifesting. The sustaining power would then be Leo by the sun, and the returning power would be Scorpio. And so we can see that when its energy first begins to manifest, this is prior to any conflict. This is its first, the seed power for it to act and manifest at all. Then this is enlivened and sustained by the egoic principle of Leo, right? Leo is like the sun, and so it begins to gravitate ideas around itself and begins to build the complexity. And so this simple primal power, which had no ability in and of itself in its primal form to interact or really conflict with any one thing, begins to generate the latent potential for conflict in Leo when it begins to form an ego, begins to form an identity, and begins to build the sustaining power of the fire element, which then comes back around through the returning principle with Scorpio, where now it has an ego, it has the ability to conflict, and so it you can kind of see this very easily in a human, where you have a human who's now built up all of these ideas about his or herself and now comes into conflict. And this is where Scorpio plays a role. But it's important to understand that with a Platonic Trinity, all of these powers, proceeding, sustaining, and returning, happen simultaneously. So for example, with the personality doesn't just proceed from the soul and then return back to the soul. You shouldn't think that the personality proceeded from the soul and then upon attaining gnosis returns back to the soul. But in fact, you should understand them as taking place all simultaneously at once. So that at once, the personality is proceeding from the soul, the personality is also being sustained by the soul, and the personality is returning to the soul. So all of you have a personality which is proceeding from your soul at this very moment, as well as returning back to your soul at this very moment. And so this goes back to the Platonic Trinity lecture in the beginning of the book, but we didn't quite go into this detail yet, where we understand that these things are happening simultaneously. And so the personality is proceeding from the soul because your soul generated the personality and is constantly generating the personality through its attention. It's sustaining it through that same principle, right? Through the constant awareness of the soul, through your own awareness, personality is ever being sustained, right? If you lose your awareness, the personality goes dormant. If you go into a coma, the personality ceases to exist, right? So awareness is sustaining the power of the personality. And then the personality is returning back to the soul because the soul is drawing from the personality experience. That's the purpose of the personality in the first place. So if we were to say that the personality, if we were to say that your vehicles, your corporeal existence is like a hammer, and the soul is like a person, you don't say that the hammer hammers the nail. You say that the person hammers the nail. Even though the hammer is the thing actually hitting the nail, you never say, oh, I'm going to go over and this hammer is going to hit this nail. You say, I'm going to hammer this nail. And the hammer is simply the vehicle that you're using. So similarly, this is the argument, this is an argument for the descended soul, where we say that the soul is, people argue, is the soul descended or is it undescended? The undescended soul doesn't really make sense, because if the soul was undescended and always perfect, it would never have a need for incarnation in the first place. And if the soul is seeking liberation from incarnation, then it never would have taken form if all it's seeking is formlessness, and if it began with formlessness. But in fact, the soul is descended. It's descended into a corporeal form. And so it's working through this body. And so when I'm speaking to you, I'm not speaking to a body. I'm speaking to a soul. You don't say that the soul is off in the heavens somewhere sitting dormant and I'm only speaking to a body, right? You say that I'm speaking to the soul, that my soul is speaking to your soul. And the hammer in this analogy is the corporeal form itself. So as a result, the soul is constantly garnering experience, right? Experience is something that's incorporeal. You can't point at experience. You can't hold experience in your hand. So naturally, we have to say that experience is itself incorporeal. And so the soul deals with incorporeal things. The body only deals with corporeal things. It's impossible for something corporeal to affect something incorporeal. And so a middle term is necessary, something which is like that which is incorporeal, but dislike it, and something which is like something which is corporeal, but also dislike it. And this middle term becomes the personality, which is both corporeal and incorporeal, right? It's both with and without form. And so the personality becomes this middle term by which the soul is able to draw experience from bodily incarnation. And so even though we're having corporeal interactions here, the incorporeal essence we're drawing from that is the experience itself. And this experience is incorporeal, which is what the soul experiences, right? It's what the soul draws from this process. So this is how the personality is always returning back towards the soul as well. So the personality is at once proceeding from being sustained by, and returning back to the soul. And this is how all of Platonic trinities work, where everything is happening simultaneously. So the energy of the fire element is both manifesting its form through Aries, being sustained by the power of Leo, and being returned back through the power of Scorpio. So this is a good opportunity where we're able to explain a little bit about the zodiac, a little bit about the planet Mars, a little bit about the zodiac of Aries, Scorpio, and Leo, and also a little bit about the Platonic Trinity itself. And all of these things are essential in the preliminary cycle. All of these things have their own lectures in the book of the preliminary cycle. So let's see, Marson asks, so the personality also ceases to be when we are in a non-lucid sleep. So non-lucid sleep isn't something that really tends to occur, right? Because the scientists like to say that you only dream in REM sleep and that it takes X amount of time to go into REM sleep and this, and that. But if you become acutely aware of your dreams, you'll realize that you dream all night long. That's the fact of the matter. And even if you take a nap, if someone were to watch you and you were to fall asleep for even just 5 minutes, and they never saw your eyes moving like you were in REM sleep, and then they woke you back up, you'd have a dream to tell. So you're always dreaming. You're always fabricating a reality, right? You're even fabricating a reality right now. You're dreaming right now. It's just that that dream is imprinted upon, or I should say, external reality is impressing itself upon your dream. So for example, when you're asleep, you're dreaming. But what are you doing when you're dreaming? Your mind is generating a reality, and its orbit is self-contained, right? The energy of your mind is orbiting around itself. And so it's fabricating all of these ideas, and this entire reality is constructed upon what's going on in your mind. But you can still be getting some external stimulus. So for example, when you're sick, oftentimes you'll have nightmares. And that nightmare will oftentimes be in some way indicative of the sickness that you have. And oftentimes, for example, if you have a viral infection or a bacterial infection, you'll have a dream that these creatures are attacking you, right? Because this is the reality that your body is experiencing. And you get a glimpse of it in your dream world. So this is kind of, you can see how even in your dream, any kind of impetus, you can imagine it as this circular orbit of your mind's energies. And anytime an external bit of data comes into that orbit, it gets caught into it and gets brought into this reality, right? So if it's very cold, all of a sudden if the weather changes in the room you're sleeping in and it becomes very cold, that cold sensation enters into your dream world, and all of a sudden it begins to snow in your dream or something like that. Right? Now, the same thing, this is what a dream is. And we say a dream isn't real. Well, the same thing is happening here. Because certainly scientific instruments tell us that the reality around us is very different from what we seem to experience. Because scientific instruments will tell us that most of everything we're experiencing is actually empty space. Right? If you were to look at a molecule, if you were to look at your hand even, which is composed of many molecules, and those molecules are composed of many atoms. And the space between every single one of those atoms is incomprehensibly large. You know, I remember in school learning in the different textbooks, it would give examples, right? Like if an atom was the size of a golf ball, how much distance would be between each atom, you know, like football fields of size. And these kind of, the space is almost incomprehensible. And so actually, if you were able to perceive your hand truthfully, you really wouldn't see anything. Everything would seem like either absolute darkness or a blinding light. And this is what you start to experience in Gnosis, actually, when you begin to perceive things truthfully. Not all Gnostic states, but some Gnostic states, you'll be perceiving reality and it will all seem like boundless white light. Just a sea of white light. And this is really a more truthful way of perceiving it in one way of looking at it, because right now you're looking at a hand and we're seeing a hand, but when we're seeing a hand, we're seeing all this substance. And when I touch it, I'm feeling substance, but really we understand that this is mostly empty space. This is mostly emptiness. And the Buddhists say the world is empty. And when you begin to go into Gnosis, you start to realize that it's all just empty. So we know that we're not actually experiencing the world as it is. We're experiencing a dream reality that's based upon what actually is. And so when we're living in this world, what's happening is my mind is still caught in this central orbit. My mind is still completely focused on itself. The only difference is when I'm awake, my senses are now externalized rather than being internalized, right? When you're asleep, when someone touches you, you don't feel it because your senses are internalized, like in a deep state of meditation. But when you're awake and someone touches you, all of a sudden you feel it because now your senses are turned on. They're externalized and they're receiving data. But what's happening in your mind is the same. Do you realize the relevance of this? That your mind is in an identical state, whether you're awake or whether you're asleep. But you hold so much more relevance to your waking life and think that your dreams are not real, that they're evanescent and they're easily forgotten and they're not real. But the fabric of your dream world is identical to the fabric of your waking reality, right? Because in both cases, your mind is orbiting itself, generating an internal reality. And in your dream world, the sense telephones, as they say in a lot of those yoga translations, right? The sense telephones are turned off. And so most of that reality is being generated internally. Whereas when you're awake, those sense telephones are turned on. And so you're still just orbiting your own internal reality, your subjective reality, but it's being fed data from the outside. And you're taking this data and incorporating it into this imaginary world you've fabricated about yourself. And this is why, like, for example, if you're talking to someone and you know that person and you know that they're a very nasty, negative person, they might look unattractive to you. Whereas if you didn't know that person and you were to meet them for the first time, you might think that they looked attractive. Because even on a physical level, the way that you view someone and the way that you judge their level of beauty is covered through this film based on all of your past experiences and how you view them and what you think about them and the opinions that you hold. And so you begin to realize that even the interactions we have with other people, when you're speaking to someone, like for example, when you're listening to me right now, you're not really listening to me. You're listening to your idea of me. And so if 3 people are sitting in a room talking, it's not really 3 people talking. It's 9 people talking. Because if I'm sitting here and I'm in a room with 2 other people, there's me, there's my understanding of person A, and there's my understanding of person B. And the whole conversation I'm having is occurring with just those people. It's me in my mind, them in my mind, and the other person in my mind. And so these 3 people are having a conversation just in my mind. And it just so happens that it has a loose correlation with the conversation that the other 2 people are having in their minds. Because all of us are having these little imaginary conversations in our head with imaginary people in our mind. But these imaginary people in our mind are loosely based on the real people in external reality. And so an unenlightened conversation really takes place in this way. The only way you can directly experience someone is through direct experience, right? Gnostic experience. And then you're not really talking, right? You're experiencing it directly. So even people who are enlightened, they're still not really directly experiencing each other unless they're in an awakened state of gnosis where they're having direct union with each other, right? That's the only way to have that kind of true knowledge, right? That's what gnosis means, is true knowledge, that true union with each other. So these are interesting things to contemplate, and it's good to talk about them. It has nothing to do with the Mars lecture at all, but it has everything to do with the spiritual path itself and how you live your life and how you cultivate your awareness and how you judge your own experiences and how you judge your interactions with other people and how you label other people and how you judge your own vices and virtues and how you judge other people, right? All very essential. So these are important things to contemplate all the time. Be contemplating these things and contemplating the nature of your own reality and how evanescent this reality is and how this is just as much of a dream. In fact, when you begin to perform mental projection, you'll find that that's one of your main obstacles, because when you begin to mental project, you'll actually get out of your body. You'll be in your mental body, standing outside of your physical body, and yet everything around you is going to be completely false. Why? Because even though you've separated your mental body from your physical body and your astral body, and even though your awareness is deeply rooted in your mental body and you're walking around outside of your other corporeal forms, your mind is so used to being caught up in its own little orbit, unless it's being fed stimulation from the physical body. And so even though you're outside of your body, everything you're going to be seeing around you is going to be fake. It's going to be completely imaginary. You'll think things are there that aren't there, and you'll think, well, I was out of my body and I walked up and I saw this was here and I touched it and I felt it, and then I went back to my body and I looked and it wasn't even there. Why? Because you fabricated it in your mind. Because your mind isn't used to drawing information for itself. It's used to just sitting in its little room all by itself and having the servant of the physical body come into that room and give it a little bit of data and then leave. And it's constantly coming in the room, dropping off some data and leaving. And the mind is like this little child playing in a room with all its little toys that the sense stimuli gave it. And so then when it has to go out on its own, it's still caught up in those little toys. And so the mental body has to learn how to directly perceive external information. So this is kind of the whole process of training in and of itself. But what you can learn about that from how your own mind works is very interesting, very necessary. Because then think about what an opinion is. An opinion to you is reality. And yet it has no basis in truth. But you develop this opinion for whatever reason because your little physical body servant dropped a little piece of data off in your mind, and the little child version of your mind is sitting there in the room and it's just making shit up that's not real. And then it decides, well, because I thought it, it must be true. And this is what opinions are, and all of you are filled with them. I'm filled with them. We're all filled with opinions. And the worst of these opinions are the ones we don't even realize are opinions. They've completely blindsided us. And we're all full of double ignorance. We can't think that just because we read the lecture on Alcibiades, or just because we read the Platonic work, the Alcibiades, now we're free of double ignorance because we know it exists and we're wary for it. No, that's so far from the truth. You're still full of it. And you need to sit down. If you truly want to be rid of it, then you need to sit down every day and contemplate and dissect all the different areas in which you have double ignorance. And even that won't rid you of it completely, but it's a good start. But none of you are going to do that because none of you are philosophers, and you're also busy living jobs. It's hard enough, right, to find time to meditate. It's more important to make sure that you're doing your meditations. But contemplation is essential. And you should find time once a week to practice contemplation. And there are times in your spiritual path and times in your life where you might dedicate additional time to that at the expense of other things because it is so necessary. Until eventually you enter into gnosis and you can begin to just let a lot of those things begin to dissolve, right? But it kind of, this story about the dream world and how this world is a dream world in a very literal sense, and the story about mental projection, all of these things should make you start to think of full of shit, Pablo, not full of it. It should make you start to think about what opinion is, right? And how opinion is just this thing that fills you and that you take as very real. And that an opinion in your mind, to an untrained mind, an opinion is just as real as this lecture you're listening to or the chair that you're sitting upon. It's just as real. So, important things to contemplate. So let's see. In practical magic, the planet Mars is used to achieve victory in an endeavor. The black magicians also use its energy to cause injury. White magicians use it for that as well, though, right? Can use martial energy for destroying demons and performing exorcisms or things like that. In fact, a very powerful mantra we have in our school for protection and for banishment, it calls upon the martial form of Dionysos. As working Theurgist, you may one day use its energy directly through invocations and rituals to effect change in yourself or someone else for the good, or to help the masters initiate change in the world at large. It can be used to battle magicians. It's used in magical warfare alongside Saturn. And then obviously it relates to things like warfare, weaponry, military strategy. Martial spirits can teach various kinds of surgery, how to craft weapons, and most importantly, from a magical perspective, it can teach the Theurgist how to gain control of the positive electric force that inhabits all life, and use it both for warfare and for healing. Perhaps one of the more interesting skills taught by some of these spirits is the now rare technique of giving life to a sword or other weapon, wherein the weapon takes on consciousness and power of its own accord. And actually, so we have this in one of these techniques in our school, right? It's how we empower the ritual dagger. And some of the students just in the level 1 class have consecrated their daggers to such a degree with this technique that their dagger will start to teleport around their meditation space. Not visibly, right? But they'll put the dagger in one place and they'll leave the room and they'll come back and it will be somewhere else. And then they'll leave and it will be somewhere else. Or some people have their dagger rotating. following the course of the sun. So they'll put their dagger down, and then they'll come back a few hours later, and will have changed its degree to follow the course of the sun. Another neat one is the heartbeat, right? Like that's one of the tests for consecrating an item, is that one of the highest levels is that it actually starts to take on a physical heartbeat. And someone, one of the students actually measured the beat of the dagger with a physical instrument, not just with their hand. So you know it's not psychic, it's physical. So these are some really crazy magical things that you start to hear happening in the school, because the school's aiming to create magicians, not just mystics, not just people who have all these nice subjective experiences. And subjective experiences are great, right? Because it's necessary for living a happy life. And that's what we're all seeking, is to live happy lives. So pure mysticism is great because it makes you happy. And what's the point if you're not happy? But more than that, we're trying to create magicians who can help make other people happy as well, and who can really begin to start living these magical lives. And so these really fancy things that you start to hear about, these really cool stories, they don't just come from scriptures and books, and they don't just come from Ramos and Veos either. Now they come from even your fellow students, and from you eventually as well. So I think that's good. We've lectured for quite a while, and you can all read the Mars lecture yourself. But let's see. So the iron is metal, or the iron is metal. The metal is iron. The stone, coral, corundum, igneous rocks, jealousy, anger, willpower, ambition, blood, strength, warfare, fighting, injury, weapons, all things like that. Obviously, the scents are going to be spicy things like cinnamon, cayenne. The signs are Aries and Scorpio. The color is red. The day is Tuesday, named after the Norse god Tyr. The plant is basil, and the animals are predatory species and poisonous creatures. So that concludes our lecture on Mars. So next week, we'll be moving on to the next lecture. What is it? Let's see. After Mars, we have Jupiter, the informing spirit of which is Zeus, king of the gods. Let's see. Pablo says, I have been involved in martial arts for most of my life and have an exalted Mars in my Rashi, which is the natal chart. So I am familiar with martial energy, but I have also experienced the nasty side of being overloaded with martial energy. It would be the watery, compassionate energy of Venus Aphrodite that would balance this out, yes? Yes, but you can also then see yourself as an embodiment of Mars and seek to worship Dionysos in order to take all of that martial energy that you have inside of you and spiritualize it. Worshipping Ares himself would be good as well, because by worshiping Ares, you're pulling in the more divine form of that energy, right? So it's not that you're filling yourself with more martial energy, it's that you're filling yourself with the ability to transform the negative martial energy that you have with a more spiritual form of it. So worshiping Dionysos would be good, even worshiping Ares would be good. But then cultivating in your life things of a more watery nature would be good. So practicing things like poetry and artwork, practicing compassionate things. And if you have trouble developing a sense of compassion and love, then yes, worshiping some of the female deities would help to generate those things inside of yourself and balance it in that way. Nathan says, it mentions in the lecture that unlike other forces, you have to take Mars by force. Can you explain how that works? That's referring to ritual work, right? Like, for example, dealing with fiery spirits requires a lot of willpower, and they'll test you in ways that involve your willpower. Just like earth spirits will test you in ways that test your patience. So, for example, you might evoke an earth spirit, and they won't come. And if you leave the ritual room after 10 minutes thinking they didn't come, then that will have actually been failing the test. The trick with earth spirits is that when you call them, even if it takes an hour, you have to simply sit there because they're testing your patience. So similarly, fiery spirits, spirits of the zodiac Aries, spirits of the planet Mars, they'll all test you in fiery ways. And similarly, all things which relate to Mars have to be taken by force in life, right? Like exercise and war and things like that. So it's just talking about the energy itself, even if you're accumulating an element, right? Like, for example, if you accumulate the water element, All you have to do is accumulate just a little bit of it, and it will naturally start to draw more of itself to itself. And water element will just start to build up inside of your body. And it's kind of easy when you're filled with it to just hold it there because it kind of sits in one place. But when you're accumulating the fire element, it's a little bit harder. You have to draw more of it in. And eventually, once you have enough of it, it will start to magnetize itself to itself, so that when you're completely brimming with the fire element and you're holding it there, the longer you hold it, the more fire element you'll actually have in your body, because it's going to magnetize other fire element to itself, just like I mentioned with the water element. But it's a little bit harder to get to that point, and when you are holding it, it's constantly trying to expand. So it takes more willpower to hold it in place. Like if you imagine it's like helium, like all these molecules are bouncing around inside of yourself, and it takes concentration to hold it in place. Whereas with the earth element, for example, you accumulate it, and a lot of it just kind of sits there. And conversely, it's a little bit more difficult to expel, whereas the fire element, much easier to expel. So Pablo says, in the next few years, I'm going to end up with all of the Hellenic gods on my altar. Interesting. So to put it bluntly, the excess of fiery martial energy that might cause me to be an asshole at times might be helped by worshiping Ares. Yes, in the same way, for example, that if you're completely helplessly pining over the loss of a lover, right? Like if someone breaks up with you and you're just lost over this intoxicating feeling of needing that person in your life, well, that's the chains of Aphrodite, right? That's the chains of maddening desire that's talked about in the Orphic Hymn. And by worshiping Aphrodite, she can help to spiritualize that energy. So instead of being filled with what is an incredibly selfish form of love, you suddenly begin to become filled with compassion. And by being filled with compassion, you forget about yourself, and then all of a sudden, you're no longer thinking about that lost love. Similarly, you say the same thing with Mars, where if you're filled with this martial energy and it's causing you to lose your temper at people and be overly judgmental, by worshiping Mars and asking for the more spiritual qualities, all of a sudden you'll be turning that laser upon yourself, and you'll just be thinking about all the ways you can improve yourself. And so you kind of see a polarity there, right? Where Mars manifesting negatively causes you to focus too much on others and not enough on yourself. Whereas Aphrodite manifesting negatively causes you to focus too much on others and not enough on yourself. It's interesting to see that balance. Eric says, can you say anything brief about Mars's history with Earth and the future? No, I can't. And I almost wonder if Gigi put you up to that, or if you guys just have the same interests, but I can't talk about those things. All right, so that's it for tonight. I'm very glad we got to have this conversation. I'm glad I got to sit here with you all. I feel very connected to all of you, and I hope that you really take this lecture to heart. There was a lot in this lecture, not just about Mars, but about the spiritual path as a whole. And I hope everyone tries to incorporate more discipline in their life and succeeds on the spiritual path. Let's end with the opening prayer. Makar hostes Joraman, deletas theoneros, biotan nagistoe kai, yasue taip sukan. All right, everyone, God bless.